So listen, I have been honored to speak with Julia in the past, but I was really excited about today because she is a rock star. If you haven't had a chance to follow her journey, it's incredible. She also talks about it in her book. And not only is Julia somebody who's passionate about this topic, but she has researched this in such a way that I told her yesterday, this book should be a course because it is one of the best researched, most intriguing narratives I think I've ever read about our space, but also just a great book to read. She also happens to be, no big deal, the senior media and technology reporter for CNBC, based at the New York, LA Bureau, and author of When Women Lead. I'm going to continue to remind you about this because Julia is not only an expert in her space, but she's taken it to authorland, and I want to encourage you all to do the same. She joined CNBC in May of 2006 as the general assignment reporter, and in 2007 moved to Los Angeles to cover media, and she's been there ever since, right, Julia, with your beautiful family?
That's right. And I added social media to my beat and then technology. So one thing led to another.
I mean, and no big deal. She joined CNBC from Fortune magazine, where she's been in business and writing since 2000. She's been doing this for a minute, y'all. Okay, she's been doing it for a minute. And during that time, she was also a contributor to Street Life, a live market wrap-up segment on CNN Headline News. Now, as a contributor to CNBC's Tech Check franchise, Boorstin covers media and tech with a focus on their intersection and technology innovation. She also delivers reporting, analysis, and interviews for the network. If you haven't watched any of her interviews, I think one of the reasons why, Julia, I really love following your journey is that you bring such a human element to your conversations with experts. It's not just the stats and the hard-hitting data, but it's also the human story behind it, which makes it really engaging. And speaking of that, she created and launched the CNBC Disruptor 50, which is an annual list that she oversees highlighting the private companies transforming the economy and challenging companies in established industries. What I want to focus on here too is that she knows the stories of people doing the work, right? Not just folks that you will typically see showing up in press, but people who are every day heads down, operating great businesses and changing the way that their industry works. So I love this again because she's highlighting people that you might not normally meet or might not normally see. I also want to talk a little bit about When Women Lead before we get into getting to know her as a person. In this book, she shares stories of over 60, that's right, 60 female CEOs and leaders that include people like Julia Collins, founder and CEO of Planet Forward, and the first Black woman to found a unicorn company. Jen Hyman, co-founder of Rent the Runway. Whitney Wolfe Herd, founder and CEO of Bumble, of which if you Google, you see her on the stock exchange, no big deal, just doing her thing. Gwyneth Paltrow, actress and founder of Goop, and so many more leaders. The stories are compelling, they're engaging, they're human, and then it's wrapped around by all this incredible data. And was it 40 pages of notes in the back of the book?
Yes, 40 pages of endnotes. The book is actually not as long as it looks. 40 pages of endnotes at the end there.
I wish it were longer. Okay. She's also received praise from the likes of Arianna Huffington, Reid Hoffman, Katie Couric, Adam Grant, so many more folks. And as an author, she's been featured. Remember, she's already on TV doing her thing on a regular basis, but also been featured by Forbes, Entrepreneur, MSNBC, The Today Show, CNBC, and so many more. So without further ado, Julia, I just want to find out, how are you feeling today? How are you doing as a person?
I'm doing great. I'm so grateful to be here. You know, it's been so awesome to get to talk about my book for so many months now. You know, it came out in October, and I think what's so inspiring is the way it's connected with so many people, particularly women. And on one hand, I'm frustrated that I think the interest in my book is really driven by a frustration that many women are feeling right now. But I'm really grateful to be part of these conversations and to get to meet and connect with so many inspiring women. It's been such a gift.
Hey, it is such a gift. And I also have to say, I think one of the big takeaways from your book is that there's so much more work to do, but you're optimistic about that work. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But before we dive in, I read your illustrious bio. Okay. So people know all the business on the internet, but I just want to talk a little bit more about you as a human being. And so I'd love for you to share quickly. I hear about your mom in the book, and I love the story about your mom. Tell us a little more about where you grew up and what inspired you to enter this field.
So I grew up here in Los Angeles in a very sort of liberal, open-minded family, but my mom had grown up really in a different time. You know, my mom grew up in the 50s and 60s, and my very brilliant grandmother, and it's interesting because I don't write about my grandmother in the book, but my grandmother probably would have been a professional violinist. had she had a job. She went to college. She was the top violinist at University of Washington in Seattle, but she didn't ever work because she got married right out of college, and she took care of my grandfather and her family. And she had small jobs here and there, working at her friends' stores, but she was a housewife in the sort of most traditional 1950s ways. And there was this amazing generational shift. If you look at my mother's generation, where when she was growing up, her mom told her, you can be a doctor. I'm sorry, you can be a nurse, not a doctor. You can be a nurse or a teacher. And that's basically it. You're going to get married, you're going to have kids, and you'll have a job, but it's never going to be the priority of your family. So my mom grew up with that upbringing. And then she ended up having this amazing career as a restaurant critic and a writer, and working at various different companies. And so my mom was this transition generation. And for me, she told me that when I grew up, I could do anything. She wasn't going to limit my potential. I could run a company. I could be a senator. I could go to the moon if I wanted. And that was her hope for me. And I grew up feeling very confident that I could do whatever I wanted when I grew up. And then I entered the working world. I was like, oh, I see how it works. Women do not hold the positions of power. Women were not the ones gracing the cover of Fortune magazine where I worked. Women were not the ones running Fortune magazine. And it was a real wake-up call. And I feel grateful that my family encouraged me to shoot for the moon. But I also feel like in many ways, I wish I'd had a little bit more preparation for the real world and how many boundaries and barriers women were going to face.
What do you think that preparation could have looked like? And maybe how are you prepping your kiddos differently for the world they're entering?
I mean, it's interesting because I also grew up in a time where people were like, oh, we want to all be colorblind and not see color. And now, and not see sexism or not see racism. I think you have to acknowledge that all of these things are there. And I have two sons, and I raise them to identify if they see sexism. We watch movies, and even movies that are 10 years old, there's rampant sexism in the storytelling, and I just think that the awareness of the need to not be colorblind, but to acknowledge things like race or differences is a shift in the way society thinks about these things. So I think for me right now, it's really important to talk about barriers, to talk about obstacles so people can overcome them. And what I really realized in my book is when I started off writing my book, I wanted it to be about all the ways that women were doing amazing things. I was very personally inspired by many of the women I got to meet and interview for CNBC, and particularly for this project I do called the Disruptor 50 List. Amazing, game-changing startup founders, investors, and I wanted to share that excitement with readers. But what I realized is that it was really important to dig into the fact, not only that women leaders are more likely to outperform, there are all these underestimated leadership skills of women, but there's also a lot of data about the barriers women face. And I realized it's important to dig into that, not because I want to make people disappointed or frustrated or depressed, but because you need to understand your obstacles to better navigate them. And that was a real revelation to me in writing the book, and how I found all this information really useful, even for myself in interacting with bias on a day-to-day basis.
Julia, I want to hone in for just a second. You could have done so many things with your career. You are an incredibly professional, impressive, expert. I'm curious, why is journalism the vehicle that you've continued to use to tell the kind of stories that you think people need to hear?
Look, of course, you look at other careers and you're like, oh, I would love to do that. I would love to try all these different things. I've always thought I would love to either work in tech at a company or as an investor. But the reality is I've fallen into this amazing job where I get to interview smart people and ask about new technologies and new ideas. And there's something about business journalism that's always provided this sort of lens of seriousness. There's so much journalism right now that's either sort of pop culture journalism that's about celebrities, or that's about opinions. And the beauty of business journalism is that it's really based on facts. And it's much easier to focus in on numbers. And of course, I love data. Again, there's a lot of data in my book to really focus on the numbers and not the bias that can creep in. And a lot of journalism that's about people disagreeing about their opinions on things. So for me, having that serious lens of like, I'm talking about facts, I'm talking about reality, about money and numbers, things that impact our everyday lives. To me, that's always been really compelling. And I've been at CNBC for 17 years. So I love my job, and I love getting to to ask tough questions, and most of the time people answer them.
Most of the time people answer. You're like, sometimes they'll answer like tough questions. I like how you talk about a lens of seriousness and that business journalism is based on facts. And I again, one of the reasons why I admire you is that you seek out the facts that maybe don't show up in business journalism as like a trend, right? So I actually want to dig in a little bit about some of the trends that you're seeing from your perspective. So what are trends that you're seeing in venture and tech and media that are really interesting to you right now?
Well, I'm of course obsessed with AI like everyone else is. So there's no doubt to me that this technological transformation, keep in mind, I entered the business journalism world in 2000. This to me is the biggest thing to happen to the tech world since the internet. More so even than, I mean, maybe akin to the shift of mobile and the rise of mobile. But this also intersects with the conversation about gender and diversity. And to me, the question that we have to keep in mind as we report on AI is, the concerns about bias. If some of these open systems are trained on the internet, which is effectively the past 30 years, the internet, there is so much bias that's encoded in that internet. If you look at what's online, there's racism, sexism, homophobia, every kind of bias is prevalent on the internet in some place or form. So there's such a risk of all that being encoded into the answers that AI chatbots deliver to people. So I think that there's a real need to focus on screens and ways to identify and remove all of that bias, so it's not perpetuated and even accelerated or exacerbated through the lens of AI. And so I think that's key. I think the other trend that is very concerning is the fact that women are not particularly well represented in the CEO roles or in the leadership positions of major AI companies. That is not unusual considering how little representation there is of women at the top of tech companies in general. But I think because this trend is going to be so influential for the future, it's really, really important to think about diversity and representation. There's been a lot about sort of like, if you don't have diversity and the people who are creating algorithms, it has this long tail impact, whether it's about facial recognition, and the biases that can be encoded in that, or any other type of technology. So I just think it's really important to have diverse representation in the people who are creating the tech tools that are ultimately going to be used by the entire world. So I think that's another big piece of that as well. The other thing I just have to point out is when I was inspired to write my book, one of the key numbers, and again, I love numbers, that really inspired me and drove me to want to write this book is the fact that between 2011 and 2021, an average of 3% of venture capital funding was going to female founders. It was never much above 3%. It was just about 3% over that decade. And I was just obsessed with this number. Why were women who compose half of the population, half of the people who go to college, and represent 80% of all buying power, raising only 3% of all venture capital dollars? It was crazy to me. It was just crazy to me. And I wanted to really dig in and understand what had enabled those women who had defied the odds and had managed to secure that 3%. What were their skills and strategies that enabled them to do so? So that was really what inspired me to write the book. But back to the trends in VC right now and in the tech space, currently the percentage of funding going to female founders has declined from an average of 3% to about 1.8%. So it has dropped below 2%. So while all of these other amazing, exciting things are happening in the tech space, the numbers are going in the wrong direction. And I think it's really important to not lose sight of that. And even though there's a sensation that the world is more accepting of female leadership, the numbers are not indicating that is the case when it comes to the tech space. So I think it's really important to keep focused on the numbers, because if the numbers aren't changing, things aren't really going to change.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to talk with you about this, because what's wild to me, and again, going back to the data, like you gave us some really great data there about the power of women as consumers in our economy, making purchasing decisions. And the wonderful white paper, The $1 Trillion Female Economy from Cake Ventures, also talks about this. So I guess part of what I've been trying to think about more lately is what needs to change about the narrative in our industry in venture and tech, because the data says so clearly that women make great bets as investors and are great bets as as founders, whether it's because they use 25% less capital per month than their peers, or more efficient, they get more profitable exits, they get better returns. We know this data, but why is our industry continuing to double down on stereotypes that simply are not going to get them returns in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the industry doubling down on stereotypes. I can't speak to that. All I could say is that the numbers do not indicate that more capital is flowing to women, period. It is not increasing. I think that, I mean, and this is really why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to arm women with the data for them to understand the obstacles they face, one, and B, the tools they have to unlock their own superpowers. I think that there is a very dominant perspective that you have to look a certain way and lead a certain way to be successful in business in general, but then particularly in tech. And I think that it's really important, not just for women, but for everyone to understand that they can be successful by leading in a way that is authentic to them and maybe does not look like a typical sort of stereotype of a tech bro in a hoodie who's, only communicating via Slack and sort of leading in a very particular top-down hierarchical way, which is the stereotype of male leadership. So I think my book really aims to enable women to identify and understand their superpowers that have not been typically elevated or celebrated in the business and tech landscape, but also really understand the biases that they're going to face so they could better navigate them. There's another piece of this, which is that in many ways, I wrote this book for men. The audience at CNBC tends to be more male. And I thought it would be really valuable for my viewers on CNBC to understand that there's a financial opportunity in investing more in women, and that they would be more successful. Men will be more successful, not only if they invest more in women, but also if they understand the financial opportunity and diversity in general. And if they start to lead in more of the ways that women typically lead, the whole world will be better off if people of any gender embrace some of these traits that women have traditionally demonstrated in business.
I want to hone in on this because I think this is, you said they need to understand the financial opportunity and diversity. And I couldn't agree more. And I think this is one of the reasons why your book is so powerful, is that it can demonstrate to men the power of leaning on, learning from women in leadership. So I'm curious for you, have you heard from men who've read your book, and how has it changed some of their behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, the real solution to this is everyone here should buy this book and give it to a man who might benefit from it. It was funny. I was speaking to a group of tech investors, some private equity, some VC. It was a big group, mostly male, and I mean, dramatically male. And I was running through some of the stats about how female founders tend to outperform. Their companies tend to go public or sell a year earlier on average. They tend to raise less money, but generate higher profits with less upfront funding. I mean, there are plenty of statistics indicating the financial opportunity in investing in a woman or a gender mixed leadership team as opposed to an all-male team. Just for context, about 85% of all venture capital dollars went to male-only founding teams. So I was talking about all these statistics and also giving some examples about how female leaders are more likely to leverage their outsider perspective to either bring new solutions to longstanding problems or identify entirely new opportunities, such as, say, investing in the femtech space, which has been entirely overlooked by the establishment for forever. So this guy comes up to me afterwards, and he was like, this stuff was shocking. I had no idea. And he's like, I didn't even realize that female CEOs were about 10% of the Fortune 500. I had no idea. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah, I thought it was more like 30%. I was like, really? Huh? Female CEOs represent 10% of the Fortune 500. That is not breaking news. Like, that information is out there, but it just really wasn't in his face. So he said to me, this really seems like an arbitrage opportunity. There seems like a great arbitrage opportunity in investing more in women. And I was like, gee whiz, I think that's right. I think that's right. But I think for him, laying out the untapped opportunity or the potential of even just thinking about about women leaders as being perhaps bringing a different approach or different solution was just something he hadn't really been thinking about, right? Because he existed mostly in a bubble of working with other men at his firm and seeing mostly pitches from men and having a certain pattern that he had to instinct to match. And this is something I write about a lot in the book, this sort of natural human instinct towards pattern matching. And there, as a society, I hear a lot about this idea of unconscious bias. And I think there's so much conversation about unconscious bias that sometimes even that term loses its power. These are like, oh, whatever, they're talking about unconscious bias again, and people tune it out. To me, this idea that pattern matching, that natural human instinct, it's not malicious, to try to match new people or ideas into existing patterns that you're familiar with, is a very fundamental and basic way to explain the problem that has been perpetuated by the tech ecosystem. Everyone's looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg. You can't blame them. Of course, they're looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg, right? But so that means they're looking for someone who looks and reminds them and sounds like and talks like and is having the same conversation as a Mark Zuckerberg type did. And by the way, the same thing can be said of any number of male tech CEOs. So when investors are looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg, they're not thinking that, oh, maybe I should be looking for the next Katrina Lake or the next Whitney Wolf Herd. And so I think that it's really important for me to make sure that I'm eliminating the assumption of malice from this. People aren't necessarily out to get anyone. They're just trying to do the thing that makes the most sense. And rationally, you want to organize the world into patterns. And there aren't as many examples of female leaders of tech companies. And that's why I wanted to share the 60 examples of female leaders and innovators and founders, and share these as these are the new patterns. So now it's not a weird surprise when a woman comes in and pitches you her AI company, because you have all these other examples to pick from. So I think we need to diversify the patterns that are out there in our society, so it's not as bewildering to the establishment when they see someone new who doesn't fit their pattern.
Right. And I want to talk a little bit about pattern matching for a second before we shift to some actionable advice and then Q&A from the audience. So when we talk about telling new stories, how do you think these stories need to show up in society so that they're disrupting patterns when people are making decisions about who to invest in, about which stories we continue to tell? Because there's a mythology that we're perpetuating about what it means to be a successful investor and founder that doesn't include the 60, stories that you've been telling. So how do we change that?
I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned people like Gwyneth Paltrow, who's like, people still think of her as a movie star. And it's like, guess what? She's raised a ton of money and has this digital platform that's really massive. So I think for me, it's always interesting to tell the stories that people don't expect to hear about people that they're familiar with. So like Reese Witherspoon, movie star, yeah, but perhaps much more important, she's created this company that sold for $1 billion that's doing content across platforms. So for me, I intentionally made the book a combination of stories about people you've never heard of, probably, unless you happen to invest in their space. So like Meena Sankaran, who is an Indian immigrant who founded this water technology company that minimizes water waste and also addresses water safety, which is an incredibly important issue, not just around the world, but also in the US. But people don't know her story, and her story is so inspiring. She overcame so much adversity. She literally survived an avalanche on Mount Everest and had to boil snow to make it water to survive. And I think we need to hear some of these more unknown stories. At the same time, I think it's important to take stories of people you've heard of, like, Jennifer Hyman or Whitney Wolf Herd or Gwyneth Paltrow, and explain that there is an unknown piece of this. There's a piece of this that people may not be familiar with that shows their grit and determination, and also their very strategic implementation of their leadership superpowers, right? So Gwyneth Paltrow admits everything she doesn't know. She's super vulnerable about her own challenges, whether it's with her separation from her husband or with postpartum depression. And then she takes that same approach in the boardroom. She's like, I have no idea what this acronym is. And everyone else is like, oh my God, I don't either. And it sort of levels the playing field for everyone to ask questions that they were afraid were dumb questions. And so instead, everyone gets to learn from the experience. So I think it's important to share a diversity of stories, but also to be aware of the fact that there has been a phase in the media where the failure of women founders in particular has been sort of focused on. And it's like the cancellation of a lot of female founders, sometimes for things that seem very reasonable reasons to get canceled. And otherwise you think, hey, maybe this person is drawing extra scrutiny and extra criticism because they are so rare as a female founder or a female CEO in this space. And I think all that just needs to be kept in mind when we think about the narratives that are being written and shared and perpetuated by the media.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And again, I think what's really exciting about this time is that we have an opportunity to really democratize access to these stories unlike ever before, because we have social media, because we have tools like your book, because people like you are in seats telling these stories. So I'd like to transition then to talk a little bit more about how women do things their own way and how that translates into success for the companies and the communities that they build for. So I'd love to hear, I love the example of Gwyneth Paltrow. I think that's a great one, right? Somebody we would imagine knows everything, doesn't. And that's great that she, again, models vulnerability, I think, is one trait that I saw over and over again in great leaders in your book. What are some other traits that we could be emulating that women leaders you've seen have demonstrated? And share examples, please, where you can.
Yes. And I would say the key thing here is authenticity, right? Everyone is different. Everyone's going to lead in their own way. There are times when it feels appropriate to be vulnerable. There are times when showing vulnerability would seem performative and it would backfire, right? So all of these traits are things that have to be authentic to the person and also appropriate in the moment. And the vulnerability thing is so interesting because, yes, it's so essential to be vulnerable and use that vulnerability to invite collaboration. Katrina Lake, when she was building Stitch Fix, she was hiring people who many people told me were like way out of her league, like the head of algorithms from Netflix. And everyone talked about her as being a talent magnet. I was like, what does that even mean? How does anyone become a talent magnet? Obviously, anyone would want to be a talent magnet. And she said, I just was clear about what my areas of expertise were and what they weren't. And I used that to hire amazing people because they felt like they would have autonomy and the authority to build out their divisions. And that was a very key thing, is that she wanted people not to feel like she was going to be micromanaging them. And it really helped her make amazing hires. So I think that vulnerability, sort of strategic deployment of vulnerability, is key. Another one is empathy, and this idea of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand what someone else is thinking. Women are more likely to demonstrate empathy in general. They rank higher on empathy tests. I have an empathy test that I link to on my website, which I scored so much higher than my husband. It was hilarious. And, but that's the thing, is that empathy, which is not about niceness, it's not about kindness, it's about really understanding where someone else is coming from. And I say it's not about niceness. It can obviously lead to compassion, but so many people on my book tour, so many men specifically, have been like, well, empathy is just being nice. Women are nicer than men. And I was like, really? That seems like a weird thing to say. The number of people who have said that to me is surprising. But I think it's really important to sort of define the term. Empathy is really enabling you to see something from someone else's perspective, essential for negotiation, not niceness, for negotiation, for working with partners, wanting to make sure that they feel seen and heard and understand how you can collaborate together. And also for employees, you're going to be a much better manager of people if you could be empathetic to where people are coming from. And then another trait, and there's so many examples of this and some great ones in the book. One of my favorite stories in the book is Dr. Toyin Ajayi. She's now CEO of City Block Health. And she created an entirely different kind of health tech company, which is driven by empathy. It's all about serving lower income patients and trying to understand what their limitations are that are preventing them from being healthy. So they employ people who are not just doctors and nurses, but also people who are effectively social workers to help their patients get access to social services and get access to housing if they're unhoused. Because what she really wants to do is understand what is preventing you from becoming healthier over the long run and moving away from the model of just putting a band-aid, like a figurative band-aid on the problem.
Well, and one question I wanted to ask you about this too was thinking about empathy in the context of building great products. And so this is, Dr. Ajayi is a perfect example of this, right? Using empathy to build products that actually solve the right problems. Are there other ways that you've seen empathy show up and then convert into better returns for companies or more successful exits or whatever it might look like? But
Yeah.
any other examples for us?
I mean, another example I would say is Shivani Soroya, who's the CEO of a company called Tala, which offers microloans in emerging markets. She started off working for the World Bank, and she was on the ground in India, and she was working with all these women and trying to understand, what was preventing them from growing their small businesses. And she saw that they just didn't have access to traditional credit, but she could see that they were saving money. She could see that they were, saving a little bit every week, that they were never late on payments for anything. And she could empathize with their drive to be successful, but also what was really limiting them. So she created this system that does not require traditional methods of measuring credit worthiness, but uses your cell phone bill, because people in emerging markets have cell phones. She said, if we could tell if you're paying your bill on time, we could tell when you're making your phone calls, to use this as a measure of whether or not you're going to be able to repay your payments. And they ended up loaning money because of her understanding of these customers. They ended up loaning money to people who were never able to borrow money before, and unlocking this entirely new market for people who could be borrowing money. By the way, you borrow a little money, you grow your business, then you could borrow more. And what was so interesting is that, yes, they charge an interest fee, nothing exorbitant, but just as a way of operating. But if you don't repay your loan on time, the only punishment is not being able to borrow money again. And it was really understanding the importance of this service to her clientele that enabled her to say, I trust these people will repay their money. And they do over 90% of the time, because the opportunity of having access to that is so meaningful to transform their business. So I think it's important to really understand your customer base and understand, by putting yourself in their shoes, what the potential is for them.
And my last question before we go to audience Q&A is, how do women leaders translate those unique key insights that they have that maybe their competitors can't, in a way that then helps them find new customers or close top investors? I'd love to hear more about the storytelling element and how women do that better, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of this is having an outsider perspective. And obviously, it's hard not to be part of the club. And much of the time, a club is a boys' club. And I think it's really important to see the value in being an outsider. And there's so many women who use that perspective in my book as a superpower. And I think about Sally Krawcheck, who had the combination of being an insider and an outsider, right? She at one point was the most powerful woman on Wall Street. On the other hand, she was the only woman in the room. So she had this sort of magical combination of insider-outsider perspective that enabled her to know the system, understand the system, but also see that it wasn't serving women. And for so long, Wall Street was like, women save, they don't invest. So she created Ellevest, which is her startup, which I write about in the book, which is really designed to serve women investors differently. They live longer than men. They may take years off to take care of their young children. So they have different situations, but they also should have the benefit of upside from investing and not just be reliant on interest rates. So I think that outsider perspective enables women to see what's broken in an existing system. Like Whitney Wolfe Herd was like, dating is broken. Men always have the control. Let me flip that. But also to just unlock so many opportunities for products and services for women. So many innovators in the retail space were like, I'm a consumer. The way the fashion industry works doesn't help me. So many female entrepreneurs, whether it was, The Real or Rent the Runway, or I mentioned Stitch Fix, that really understand that, like, I'm a consumer and I'm not being served. Like, I need to create products for people like me. And obviously the health space has been another category like this. The women make the vast majority of health decisions for their entire family, not just for women. So there's that women are the decision makers there, but also women's health issues have been fundamentally overlooked. Recently, we've seen a rise in startups in the fertility space. There is a company called Kind Body that I write about in my book, as well as Carrot Fertility. And then also recently, and I don't include any of these companies in my book, but I wish I had, is companies in the menopause space. So this idea that there is a lifetime of products and services for women that have not existed yet, and there's an opportunity in that. I think that's really something that, like, is a great opportunity for male investors to think about serving that other half of the population.
Okay, folks, listen, bet on women. Women are seeing industries in a way that maybe their peers can't, and it gives them an opportunity to then build a solution for their market that previously wasn't available because it wasn't showing up in the way that women needed it to show up. So without further ado, I want to move to audience questions. I'm receiving the questions on Twitter. If you haven't already done so, please jump in, use the link that Christy shared, and drop your question. So the first question is over to Divya. Divya, thank you for your question. She asks, Julia, what's the biggest mistake you've made and what did you learn from it?
I am very self-critical. I know many women are. And I, for much of my life, was afraid to mostly like pitch a story or do something until I was 100% sure that it was done, ready, watertight, bulletproof. And I wouldn't go to my bosses with an idea until I was like 100% ready. And sometimes the moment would pass and I would miss a chance to do something as a result of that. And I think it's really important to not be so afraid of failure and to push myself out of my comfort zone to try things or do things, even if there's a chance I'm going to fail or it's going to be rejected. And I think a lot of my female friends and cohort have been on that same journey of not being as afraid of failure. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? And let me just try the thing, pitch the idea, ask for the big, crazy interview. And if someone questions me, I know what I'm doing. I've been a journalist in the business news space for 23 years, and just to feel confidence in my age and experience and use that as something to bolster me when I'm taking risks and being prepared to fail.
I really appreciate you sharing that, Julia. And I think what I want to remind folks in the audience about is Julie has had a prolific career thus far, and she's just getting started, folks. And so even hearing that Julia Boorstin has had this experience, just remember that next time you're like, well, what if I fail? Well, what if you fail? But the bigger question is, what if you never take the swing and you never get the shot? So do it. All right. Great question, Divya. Thank you. Heading on over to Sarah, who says, I love that you wrote this book for your male audience. And I do too. She said, did you learn anything new that surprised you when writing this book?
Oh my gosh, so much surprised me. So I have to say, I had the gift of writing this book during the pandemic. I started on the book proposal before the pandemic hit. And then once the world shut down and it was that March of 2020 and we canceled our spring break plans with the kids, I was like, I'm just going to get this book proposal out there. Who knows how long I won't have to travel for work. So I might as well just rush to get this into the world. And of course I didn't realize it would be years, but there was something about getting to really dive into this at a time that was so dark and bleak, and to feel like I was just getting to get these amazing stories and empowering data. And I feel like every day I had this gift of getting to have dinner with my kids and be like, oh my God, I read this amazing study about how the real benefit of diversity is not having outside perspectives, but about how all the original people in the room get smarter because they're surrounded by people who are different than them. And it brings out the best in them. And to me, like all of these revelations, it changed my way I thought about so many things. But there's one thing that I think about all the time that I did not know at all before I did research for my book, is this idea that gratitude can be a superpower in business. And there's all this amazing data, which I write about in the book, that explains how practicing gratitude drives patience. So I always thought about gratitude as a personal trait. This is something that you do with friends and family. It has nothing to do with work. What would it, other than being grateful for my job? But I think that is really, really important to look at this correlation between gratitude and patience when it comes to the business world. If you are feeling grateful for where you are and good in the moment for where you are, then you're not going to make the decision that's the near-term fix, the anxious rush for a quick fix. You're going to say, I'm good now. I'm good. I feel grateful for what I have, what I've accomplished. Then you could say, I'm grateful for where I am now, so I can think more big picture, more long-term, and make decisions that are going to be wiser over the long run. And I think it's really, really important to practice that every single day. If I feel grateful, I'm not going to be anxious about what do I need to do right now. I'm going to be thinking, how am I going to be a better reporter? And how am I going to set myself up to succeed in a month, 2 months, 6 months? And the data about this is just mind-blowing.
I'm so grateful that you brought that up, speaking of gratitude, because I also think what I've noticed in women leaders that I really admire as well is that they demonstrate that gratitude to other people and they're transparent about it. Listen, this is challenging right now, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. I'm grateful for the lessons I'm learning. I'm grateful for where I'm going to be. And I'm grateful for the people around me, and telling them that, communicating that.
100%.
that piece, I think, goes a long way to build trust with people. So I love that. Thank you
And
for sharing
actually,
that.
it was the interview. I mean, I discovered this not because I was reading a Harvard Business Review article about gratitude, but because I had done a bunch of interviews back to back to back, where these women I was interviewing were talking about how they felt so grateful. So it was like Whitney Wolfe Herd, grateful for her traumatic experience at Tinder. It was like, Sally Krawcheck, grateful that she got fired from Citi. Like all these women were talking about things they were grateful for. And I was like, grateful, like those sound like traumatic experiences. But everyone was talking about their gratitude. Julia Collins, grateful for the chance that she had an opportunity to impact the environment. And she was like living at a time, and she had this combination of experiences where she could have that impact. And one example after another, I was like, there's something here, right? There can't be so many different women talking about gratitude. And that led me to the research. And women are more likely to practice gratitude and enjoy the feeling of gratitude than men are, which is another thing I was surprised to learn, but maybe not surprised to learn.
She's like, listen, everyone, I'm ready for Julia. I'm ready for your show where you just talk about, you interview all these people. Anyway, I want to speak it into existence, Julia. I want to speak it into existence. Let me take us to our next question. Chidima says, what do you believe are the primary reasons which we women can influence for the lack of women in leadership seats? So let me just make sure I'm understanding your question, y'all. What do you believe are the primary reasons which we can influence? Yeah, like how can we influence the lack of women in leadership seats? What can we do?
What can we do to drive change?
What are the primary reasons and how can we drive change? Chidima, feel free to let me know if I misinterpreted your question.
I mean, I think the primary reasons behind the lack of women in leadership is just a perpetuation of the same situation. There's a lot of really great data from McKinsey and Lean In. Every year they come out with a different study in the fall. And a couple of years ago, they wrote about this idea of the broken rung, and this idea that women are getting promoted at a slower rate than men are. So the issue is not pay equity. The issue really is promotion equity. And so women are dropping off and missing like the key promotion, which I think is the third promotion, because maybe they're having kids, or maybe their kids are young and they're not asking for the promotions as frequently as their male colleagues are. If you miss out on those promotions, it's much, much harder to get to the top. And the study that came out from McKinsey and Lean in late October of last year shows these pipelines of people who are entering the workforce and looking both at gender as well as race. And what happens is that at every level of promotion, the white men, their pipeline gets bigger and they end up with more roles, not just at the C-suite, but on the levels ahead of that. So it's not something that could just be fixed at the C-suite. It's something where companies really need to examine not just their hiring practices, but specifically their promotion practices at every level of that pipeline. And if you haven't seen that study, I highly recommend looking at it, just because it really illustrates it well. And it's been very helpful for me to just show those pipelines to companies and be like, look at this, like, look at how impactful it is if white men get promoted dramatically more than everyone else at every level. So I think that's sort of the reason behind it. And then in terms of solutions, I think it's all about transparency. Data, you can't have transparency unless you have data. You can't change things unless you understand the problem. So data. I think it's important to highlight that a number of male-led companies, such as Salesforce and PayPal, have invested a lot in understanding their promotion gaps. Not just around women, but also people of color. I did a story for CNBC a couple years ago about what Salesforce was working. I'm sorry, this particular one was about PayPal, but how they were creating these systems to make sure they were really promoting equitably. And understanding how unconscious bias can creep into decisions about how and when to promote people. And also to remove the idea of, if you bang on the door and ask for a promotion, you're going to get promoted more quickly by promoting at a predictable and evaluating people at a predictable and established cadence. So I think that's really important. And the more companies can have transparency about everything and have analytics about everything, the more they'll be able to make decisions based on facts and not based on unconscious biases.
Data, folks. She's been telling you. Okay. All right. Last question here. And then Julia, we're going to wrap up quickly because we need to get you out of here by 9:55 a.m. So this comes from our good friend. I'm going to scroll up really quickly. Julia Rose says, Julia mentioned that she wrote When Women Lead in part to inform men of the financial opportunity of investing in diversity, as women make up less than 18% of decision makers in VC. She's giving us data, okay? Love that this book fills a huge need to educate men. This is a continual problem I see. Most of those fighting for pay investment equity tend to have their target audience as women plus. I'd love to know if she can recommend any other orgs or people working towards equality within their market or their target audience, and that audience is men in VC or startups.
Any other, I mean, what's interesting is I think that All Race is obviously a great example of this. And you're really working with partner companies that are male-led and that understand the value in being allies. And I want to make sure I understand the question fully here. I mean, there are organizations, one is called Him for Her, which is having men understand the value of getting women on boards. And that specifically, and I went to one of their dinners, they brought together men and women, women who are potential board candidates, and the men understanding that they would benefit by having that additional diversity on their boards. So I think there are some of them, but I think for the most part, it's just about having these conversations. And I think shifting the dialogue away from the idea that diversity is like a corporate perk, and more towards that it's a financial imperative for companies. And to me, that's the conversation that I think as a business journalist is really valuable to have.
Fantastic. And I'm going to sneak in this last question because it's something that we've been seeing a lot. So for quick context, I've been on a 7-city tour as we've been talking to our community from May 17th to June 21st. And the one topic that came up in every conversation was male allyship. And so Faye asks, how can we develop and find more male allies? What do you think, Julia?
This is a big question, right? This is really important. I think really coming to it with an attitude of collaboration. I think nobody wants to be blamed. Nobody wants to have a finger pointed at them. Everyone wants to feel like there can be a partner and an opportunity. And I think that a lot of men are afraid that that they don't want to be blamed for the bad situation that we're in now. And so they don't want to be lumped in with people who are part of the problem. And so I think the more we could be encouraging of men to understand that this is in their best interest and we're happy to have them there, I think the better. And there's so many men who have gotten this book for their daughters, ended up reading it. And I think, we're at a moment where on one hand, there's great opportunity for change because there is data. And on the other hand, because of financial instability and volatility, there is a risk that a lot of the emphasis placed on these issues is diminished or goes away because it's not considered a key financial priority right now. And I think what's really important is emphasizing that right now, economic uncertainty, if there's a recession, whatever it may be, it's not the time to walk away from these conversations, but we're there to be partners and to have open conversations about how this can be a valuable tool rather than something that you see as an unnecessary perk.
Thank you so much, Julie. We're also focusing more on male allyship in the coming years. We have incredible male allies in our community and look forward to sharing their stories as well. So without further ado, it's time to wrap up. Julie, I've got 2 final questions for you. First is, what is your final piece of advice for our audience today?
Help each other out. Don't be afraid. Help each other out and don't be afraid. I think I've really been impressed by the number of women who have helped me, but also voluntarily recommended other women for me to understand and to know as people that need to be celebrated and elevated in this ecosystem. And I think that the narrative for so long was that, the catfight stereotype and women aren't going to help each other. And I think for a long time, it wasn't in women's best interest to help each other because there was only room for one of them at the top. And now there is room for more, and everyone will be more successful if we help each other rather than trying to elbow each other out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia. My last question for you is, listen, people want to know more about you in addition to reading your book, buying your book, or winning the book by entering a comment. Where can they follow you on a regular basis?
So you can watch me on CNBC, but you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Julia Boorstin. On Twitter, I'm at J Boorstin. Someone took my name on Twitter, but you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. I don't really do much on Facebook. And on LinkedIn, yes, follow me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of awesome stories and also clips from CNBC on LinkedIn. So I'm Julia Boorstin on LinkedIn. And feel free to connect and reach out. And I'm just so grateful to be part of this community.
Julia, such an honor. Thank you again for your time today. We wish you all the best. We'll continue to follow and look forward to talking with you again soon.
Bye. Thank you so much.